It was the summer of 2002 in a small town just outside of Providence, Rhode Island, where I grew up. For reference, I'm a 21-year-old woman. That summer, I was between my junior and senior years at college. I decided to stay on campus, taking a few classes to ease the workload for my final year. I rented a cozy little apartment with a couple of friends, and we really enjoyed it. The town was quiet and small, with many college students nearby, and I loved how close we were to the beach during the summer. My schedule was pretty flexible. Although I worked part-time and took classes, I had plenty of free time, which I enjoyed. Fitness and exercise were always important to me, and one of my favorite activities that summer was taking my rollerblades to the local bike path. I would listen to music on my earbuds as I skated down the long, straight path. I'd drive to the nearby park my car, and skate the mile-long path. When it ended, a second park started. I'd rest on a bench near the second park, drink some water, and then turn around to skate back, covering about 2 miles each time. I did this almost every day because it was fun and excellent exercise. This routine continued until something unsettling happened. One morning, I slept in and was running late for my daily workout. I couldn't find my earbuds where I usually left them. After searching for a while without success, I decided to go for my workout without them. At the park, I put on my rollerblades and started my first mile. It was a beautiful July day, and I was enjoying myself, but around halfway through the mile, I had a strong feeling that something was wrong. Even though the temperature was in the 80s, I had goosebumps all over my arms and legs, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I had a deep feeling of dread, which I couldn't shake. I've always trusted my intuition, and it's never let me down before. This feeling was a warning. I kept skating, but I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, but I couldn't figure out why I felt this way until I saw him. There was a man standing off the side of the path. The first thing I noticed was that he was stepping backward, trying to hide behind a tree, but his face was still visible. He was watching me with a cold, emotionless gaze. He had his hands in his pockets and stood still as I skated closer. My stomach dropped. He wasn't wearing workout clothes. He was dressed in a baggy hoodie, jeans, and work boots. Definitely not someone out for exercise. I had to make a quick decision. Should I turn around and risk losing my momentum, or should I keep skating past him and hope he wouldn't rush me? My fear quickly turned into anger. I had dealt with my share of harassment and violence from men in the past, and I wasn't going to let this man intimidate me. I decided I wasn't going to back down. As I skated by, I made sure to memorize his appearance. I noted his dark eyes, beard, and his plain blue cap, hoodie, jeans, and boots. My fists clenched, and I glared at him with a look that said, "I see you, and I'm not afraid." We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably just a few seconds. Then he looked away, and I knew he'd changed his mind about whatever he had planned. Still, I wasn't safe yet. I skated as fast as I could to the second park, getting off the path as quickly as possible. Now, I was faced with a dilemma. My car was a mile away, and I couldn't risk going back down that path and passing him again. I didn't know where he might have moved, and I didn't want to take any chances. So, I took off my rollerblades and walked along the road that ran parallel to the path, carrying my skates. Probably looked odd, but I didn't care. The walk seemed to take forever, and I was relieved when I finally reached my car. I locked myself inside and drove away, vowing never to go back to that path again. But the story didn't end there. Later that evening, I went to work my shift as a waitress. When I got home around 10 p.m., I found my neighbor, a guy who lived upstairs, pacing in the parking lot, talking on his phone. He and his girlfriend were both nice enough, though I didn't know them very well. He had been crying, and when I approached, he told me his girlfriend had been attacked by a stranger. She was recovering from injuries, including a head injury from hitting the concrete. When he mentioned the bike path, I froze. I asked him if the attack had happened there, and he said it had. My heart sank. I told him I knew exactly who had done it, explaining my encounter earlier that day. He asked if I could give a description to the police, and because I had made sure to remember every detail about the man's appearance, I was able to provide a thorough description. For months, I checked the news, hoping to hear that the man had been caught, but I never saw any updates. As for the woman who was attacked, she made a full recovery, but soon after, she and her family moved out. I never saw her again. I felt guilty for escaping what happened. I couldn't shake the thought that somehow the attack had been meant for me, but I had narrowly avoided it. The final strange part of the story came the next day. I found my earbuds on the kitchen counter, exactly where they had been the day before, even though I had searched the entire apartment and they hadn't been there earlier. I couldn't explain it, but I have a feeling my heightened awareness and maybe some higher power helped me avoid a dangerous situation. The abandoned shack 4 years ago, I was in my second year of high school and hadn't yet gotten my driver's license. It was also around the time I started experimenting with some substances. One of my neighborhood friends, let's call him Jack, knew of a creek about 1.5 miles from my house that made for a great place to smoke, but getting there was a bit of a trek. There were rumors about a few rundown buildings in the woods nearby, like a dozen or so concrete huts, old fire pits, and some strange platforms and trees. I wasn't sure who had built them, but they were all close together, about 1/4 mile in from the woods and about 1/2 mile away from any road. We'd been there many times, usually with more people, but since we lived in a fairly nice suburban area, it never felt too risky. Plus, no one had ever been seen in the area before. The spot had become a regular hangout for kids our age. We figured it was just some old abandoned homeless camp, but stories still floated around from other high schoolers about creepy things lurking there, like people with hooks for hands, serial killers, or even cannibalistic families, your typical scary stories you'd tell by a campfire. The concrete hut itself was about 7 feet by 7 feet and around 5 feet tall, but the ground inside had been dug out, making the roof taller. When we first found it a couple of years ago, there were signs of life, improvised weapons, food cans, and trash, but over time it had mostly just become littered with beer cans, cigarette butts, and roaches from local kids. Inside, there were sharpest scribbles, and a tarp covered the place, giving off a strong smell of urine, so no one ever really went in. Not far from the hut was a lookout platform built into a tree. There was a makeshift ladder made from branches leading to the 5-foot by 5-foot platform about 20 feet up, though the wood had started to rot, making it a challenge to climb. On this particular October evening, Jack and I set out around 6 p.m., hoping to get there before it got too dark. We had other places closer to my house where we smoked, but none had the same draw as the shack. We made our way through some backyards, across a field, and finally passed through the tree line. There were stones arranged across the creek that let us cross without getting our feet wet. By the time we arrived, the sun had almost completely set, and not much light was left filtering through the trees. It was the first time we'd been there at night, and the atmosphere felt different. Both of us felt uneasy, and we kept our voices to a whisper. We didn't want to get too close to the hut, so we decided to stay about 50 feet away, right on the edge of the bluff we just climbed. As I shifted a few feet over to get more stable ground, I felt my foot get caught on something. A fishing line stretched about 1 foot above the ground, tied to a nearby tree. Suddenly, there was a loud clang as the line pulled a metal bucket into some scrap metal stuck in the ground. It was clearly some kind of alarm. Almost immediately, we heard someone moving down from the platform in the tree, about 20 feet away, before dropping to the leaves below. Without thinking, we bolted down the bluff, slipping and crashing into trees as we went. We could still hear footsteps and grunting behind us. We reached the bottom and sprinted through the creek, but I tripped on some loose rocks and fell into the cold water. I quickly scrambled to my feet and kept running. Moments later, we heard splashes behind us. We finally reached the tree line and were now in an open field about a quarter-mile wide. We ran as fast as we could, but we were both out of breath and injured. The person behind us was catching up. We could hear their heavy breathing and the pounding of their footsteps, getting closer and closer. We sprinted through a yard, and I could hear dogs barking loudly in the distance. Just as we reached the middle of the street, a car slammed on its brakes, and Kurt and I had to stop suddenly to avoid getting hit. We turned around and saw someone standing just outside the reach of a nearby house's floodlights. Then they turned and ran back toward the woods. We quickly apologized to the driver, ditched the weed, and I called my sister to pick us up. We told her what had happened, but we never went back to that creek after that. When I was younger, around 8 years old, I believe I saw my first ghost. We were hiking in the Smoky Mountains, camping in a remote area. I was terrified of sleeping in the woods near the top of a mountain, but my mom assured me we would be fine. "Animals are afraid of your dad," she said, teasing as she held my hand. I trusted her, but I was still nervous. We hiked along the trail until my dad decided it was time to stop and set up camp. We found a peaceful clearing just as the sun was starting to set. I looked at my mom and noticed she looked pale, her hand gripping mine tightly. "Can we set up somewhere else?" she asked, still holding my small hand. She seemed uneasy about the energy of the woods, and I felt it too. I was scared. My dad shook his head. "It's getting late, Han. I'm not going to look for firewood in the dark." I remember asking if we could go home. The small clearing had an eerie feeling to it. After eating some hot dogs and roasting marshmallows, we crawled into our 6-person tent that my dad had bought. He fell asleep within minutes, but my mom and I couldn't sleep. "Mom, are you asleep?" I asked, lifting my head.
No, unei imawaka.
"What's wrong?" she replied. "I'm scared. I can't sleep." "It's okay. We're safe in here," she reassured me. Eventually, I dozed off, but I woke up early the next morning. I stepped out of the tent and saw my mom sitting on the ground, meditating. She always meditated in the mornings with a cup of Earl Grey tea. I walked over to her and tapped her shoulder. "Can we go for a walk?" I asked. She opened her eyes and nodded. "Sure, but let's not go too far. I don't want your dad to worry." We started hiking near our campsite when my mom suddenly stopped. I followed her gaze and saw a faint figure of a man leaning against a birch tree about 20 feet away. He appeared gray, like a mist, but didn't seem scary, just calm and sad. He lifted his head and looked in our direction. I rubbed my eyes, and the figure faded away. My mom just looked at me, and without saying a word, I understood. That man didn't mean any harm. He was just a quiet, sorrowful presence. After that, I don't think I ever saw a ghost again, but I'll never forget that moment. Late one evening, my friend and I decided to go out and smoke some weed. This was back before it became legal in Colorado, so we had to be a little discreet about it. We went to the backyard and sat down. We hadn't even lit up yet when the gate leading to the alley suddenly opened. From there, we saw something small that seemed like a mix between a goblin from a fantasy film and Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, but it looked much more lifelike, if that makes sense. The creature had something like a cloak, though I wasn't entirely sure. When I looked up at it, just as quickly as the gate had opened, it disappeared, retreating back into the alley and silently shutting the gate behind it. The whole thing was so fast and strange it almost seemed unnatural, but it showed me that there are things that we don't always see, even in a big city. The next experience happened when I was hiking in the remote woods of Ohio. It was a peaceful nature walk, and this was at a time when marijuana wasn't legal in Ohio. I'm not even sure if it is now. Back then, if you wanted to enjoy a joint, you had to walk a good 10 miles into the wilderness to avoid being caught. I had just lit up and was soaking in the sounds and sights of the forest when I heard something from behind me. Turning around, I saw what looked like a huge figure, about 15 feet tall, gliding from one tree to the next. At first, I was freaked out, but after a moment, I convinced myself that maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me. I turned back to the creek and gave it another look, only to hear what sounded like a high-pitched whistle. This time, I saw it again. A tall, slender figure, almost bouncing from tree to tree, making that same strange sound. I've heard of Sasquatch sightings. Some of them show tall, thin creatures, while others depict massive, muscular ones, but this was different. It wasn't like the Slender Man either. It seemed more like a puppet or something in long, dark clothing that swayed as it moved. I can't fully describe it, but it was odd. I quickly left those woods, and I haven't seen anything like it since. If you ever find yourself out in those Ohio woods, be careful. There's something unsettling lurking out there. Glenn Michaels was renowned for his accomplishments in both running and mountain climbing, having won races across all 7 continents. He visited 142 countries and conquered over 190 mountains. In 1985, Glenn moved from Los Angeles to Carson City, where he stayed due to his deep affection for the surrounding hills. At the time of his disappearance, he was 6 feet tall, weighing 155 pounds, with silver hair and green eyes. On the day he vanished, he was wearing a red t-shirt and beige shorts. On a Saturday, Glenn set out on a solo hike along an off-trail route, but he did not return as expected. His absence was noted on Sunday. Known for his daring spirit, Glenn had climbed many of the world's tallest peaks, often tackling difficult and technical routes and leading others through challenging climbs. His name was well known in both competitive running and mountain climbing communities. His passing sparked an outpouring of respect and admiration from those who followed his athletic journey. Glenn set numerous records, including victories in his age group at the Abbott World Marathon Majors and completing marathons across every continent, including Antarctica. He also reached the summits of several iconic mountains, including Denali, Kilimanjaro, and Elbrus. Glenn's website chronicled his remarkable adventures, with photo collections and lists of the countries he had explored. He was remembered as a person full of adventure, driven to achieve his ambitious goals. The exact details surrounding Glenn's climb of Mount Clark and his final moments are still under investigation by park officials, and further information may come to light as the inquiry continues. However, this tragic event serves as a stark reminder of nature's unpredictability, emphasizing that you never know when your last day will come. My deepest condolences go out to Glenn's family. During my high school years, I was heavily involved in the school basketball team and track events to stay in shape. To keep up my stamina, I regularly hiked a winding 11-mile trail that passed through the intimidating hills just outside my quiet little town, where everyone knew everyone. While the area wasn't completely isolated, the trail had a peculiar vibe, especially in certain sections deep within the woods. There, the path grew rough, with dirt and mud patches tangled with tree roots that twisted and turned like snakes in every direction. The challenge intrigued me, forcing me to focus carefully on each step, without realizing how much energy I was expending. For 3 years, the trail remained a regular and reliable retreat, until that one fateful day, when both literal and figurative darkness seemed to fall upon me, just as it had many times before. I parked my car on a desolate dirt road, a quiet offshoot of the main highway, and took a brief moment to smoke a joint, letting the smoke calm my nerves. I slipped on my earphones, popped a piece of gum into my mouth, and selected a playlist on my phone. Then I set off on the trail. Strangely, I couldn't recall having seen anyone that day, although it was the afternoon, and the trail was usually quiet compared to the busier evening hours. Several minutes passed as I walked along the crushed stone path, and as I reached a certain point, the trail started to change. The environment became wilder, and a sense of unease crept in. The most remote section of the trail, where I felt the strangest sense of foreboding, had no obvious cause. The air seemed to grow colder, and a cold dread began to tighten around my chest. Still, I pressed on, trying to push the unsettling feeling away. As the path steepened, I slowed my pace to a cautious walk and took out my earphones. In the silence, I became keenly aware of the eerie quiet that surrounded me. The usual sounds of nature, wind rustling through the leaves, birds chirping, were completely absent. That unnatural stillness only made me more anxious. But I was oblivious to the real danger that was watching me from somewhere in the shadows. The woods around me, thick with trees, had always been home to wild animals like coyotes or even the occasional bear, but the fear that seized me felt different, something beyond the usual threats of the wilderness. In a brief and hazy memory, I recalled a blurry vision of something or someone lurking among the trees. It wasn't an animal or a ghost. It was unmistakably human, a man, a presence that I couldn't quite bring into focus. I instinctively avoided looking directly at him, driven by a primal gut feeling. But the figure wasn't behind me as I had assumed. Stood ahead, off to my right, frozen like a statue. It didn't move, just watched me silently as I continued on. The air around me grew heavy with tension. Every part of my body screamed to flee, and when I rounded a bend about 15 feet further, my body reacted purely on instinct. A burst of adrenaline shot through me, making me sprint like I had never run before. My knees wobbled, but the rush of fear pushed me faster than I ever thought possible. Even though I couldn't hear footsteps following me, it felt as if they were just behind me, ready to pounce. A raw, primal terror gripped me, drowning out all reason. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, where I finally slowed to a panting halt. Trembling from the aftermath of the fear-driven sprint, I found no one chasing me. The figure, the menace, was gone, leaving me with nothing but the thundering of my thoughts and a deep, unsettling feeling that something had been there, hiding in the woods, waiting for the right moment to strike. Maybe it was all just a bad trip, a stoned teenager getting spooked in the woods, but I had followed the same routine for years, whether sober or not, and had never experienced anything like that before. It was an event that refused to be explained or rationalized. Though I eventually left that town behind, the memory of that day stayed with me, haunting my thoughts and making me hesitant to return to the trail. The same feeling of dread now sits with me, reminding me that the woods may not be as safe as I once thought. I often wonder if other hikers have had similar experiences, but I never asked. I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy. I've always felt drawn to the mystery and beauty of nature. So, when a chance came for a hike in the lush woods of Michigan with my friends, I eagerly agreed. Little did I know that what started as a peaceful adventure would soon turn into a terrifying encounter with a creature from local legend. The day started with clear skies and a light breeze that rustled the trees. I reached the trailhead early, excited to start my solo journey. My friends and I planned to meet at the end for a small celebration. The path snaked through thick woods, covered in a colorful blanket of fallen leaves. As I set off, the smell of pine filled the air and the sounds of birds echoed through the trees. With every step, the forest grew denser, and sunlight struggled to break through the canopy, casting strange, flickering shadows across the ground. But something strange began to stir within me. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that the woods were hiding something, whispering, warning, though there was no sound. I pushed on, trying to ignore the rising unease, determined to keep going. However, as the hours passed, the atmosphere grew heavier. The silence in the forest was unnerving, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. Every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves felt like the presence of something unseen. Then, as I rounded a bend, a strange odor hit me, like wet fur mixed with decaying leaves and a sharp metallic scent. My heart raced, and my instincts screamed that something was wrong. But curiosity got the best of me. I moved closer, my senses on high alert, and suddenly, branches crackled nearby. My pulse quickened as I scanned the trees, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the sunlight, partially hidden by the dense woods, was a creature like nothing I had ever seen. It stood tall on two legs, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its shape was a grotesque fusion of man and beast. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, filled with malice, and its lips curled into a menacing grin, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Time seemed to freeze. The realization hit me hard. I was face to face with the mythical creature, the Michigan Beast. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to flee, but something held me in place. The creature's eyes locked with mine, its gaze promising no escape. Then, without warning, it lunged, claws extended, and its growl shaking the very air around us. I reacted on pure instinct, narrowly dodging its first attack as it swiped at me. My legs buckled, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. It was relentless. The creature followed, moving with terrifying speed and power, its hunger for flesh palpable in the air. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my thoughts clouded by fear. I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was. Lost in this nightmarish forest, there was no way out. The creature's pursuit was unyielding. Then, just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I spotted something ahead. A small, decrepit cabin standing amidst the trees, barely holding together. It was my only chance for shelter. With adrenaline fueling my every move, I raced toward the cabin and slammed the door behind me, the old wood groaning under the pressure. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and fear. The sounds of the forest were muted, replaced by an unsettling silence. The hours crawled by, each second feeling like an eternity, but there was no sign of the beast. As the night wore on, the sky darkened and the moonlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, casting eerie shadows. I felt sleep pulling me in, a temporary escape from the horror outside. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. When I woke, daylight had returned. The sun bathed the cabin in a soft, golden light. I felt a surge of dread, but gathered what little strength I had left and opened the door. To my relief, there was no sign of the creature. The forest seemed calm, its previous terrors vanishing as though they had never existed. I stumbled back onto the trail, my body bruised and exhausted, and made my way back to civilization. But the image of that creature, the Michigan Beast, remained burned in my mind. It was no longer just a legend. It was a reality that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the horrors lurking in the heart of the wilderness. I couldn't believe my fortune when I first set foot on the iconic Cascade Trail. The thought of hiking through the stunning wilderness and truly experiencing nature had always drawn me in. With my pack firmly secured and excitement rushing through me, I set off on the journey I had dreamed about. The first few days felt like a dream come true. The sun shone brightly above, warming the rugged path beneath my boots. The views were breathtaking, with towering peaks, dense forests, and crystal-clear lakes. I embraced the solitude, savoring each step on the winding trail. But, as nature often does, the weather turned unexpectedly. On the fourth day, dark clouds quickly filled the sky, swallowing the vibrant blue. A cold gust of wind cut through my jacket, making me shiver uncontrollably. The air grew thick with tension, as though something ominous was approaching. I pulled out my map and realized that I had several more miles to the nearest campsite. Determined, I tightened my pack straps and pushed forward, hoping to reach shelter before the storm fully hit. Hours dragged on as the weather grew more intense. The wind howled through the tall trees, bending them unervingly. Fat raindrops began to fall, hitting the leaves with a sharp, chaotic rhythm. What had once been a well-trodden trail quickly turned to mud, making every step a tiring challenge. My boots sank into the wet ground, slowing my progress and exhausting me. As the light began to fade, panic crept in. I needed to find shelter before night took over. Just as I was about to lose hope, I spotted an old, abandoned cabin tucked away among the trees. Its windows were shattered, and the wood looked aged and worn. Despite its dilapidated appearance, it promised protection from the raging storm. With a surge of hope, I reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay, and my flashlight illuminated the eerie, forgotten interior. The furniture was rotting, untouched by human hands for many years. As I ventured further, my heart raced when I found a dusty, handwritten note on a table. The faded words spoke of a terrible entity that haunted the woods, preying on those who sought refuge in the cabin. A chill ran down my spine. Was this just a silly warning? Or was there truth to this dark tale? I couldn't help but wonder. Suddenly, a blood-curdling wail echoed through the trees, shaking the walls of the cabin. The sound sent me stumbling back, my heart pounding with fear. It was as if the storm had awoken something dreadful. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed my hiking poles and bolted for the door. The wind lashed against my face, and the rain blurred my vision as I ran through the forest, desperate to escape. The creature's eerie cries echoed, and I felt branches tugging at my clothes as I sprinted. My legs screamed with exhaustion, but ahead, I saw a flicker of light, a sign of the campsite I'd been aiming for. Summoning all the strength I had left, I pushed through the pain and finally burst into the clearing, breathless and soaked to the bone. Other hikers rushed to my side, their faces full of concern when they saw my disheveled state. They wrapped me in warmth, offering their tents and supplies as the storm raged on. The days passed, and eventually, the storm subsided, allowing us to continue our trek along the Cascade Trail. That experience would stay with me forever, reminding me of the wild, unpredictable forces of nature and the strength within us to face them. As I reflect on that terrifying day, I urge all who follow this path to approach it with caution and reverence. For behind the beauty of the wilderness, there are dark, untold dangers that can test your very will to survive.